It's a great pleasure to be here. I genuinely believe the Westminster Abbey Institute does absolutely tremendous work, and one of the really enjoyable and worthwhile things that I've been able to do since I stepped down from my job with MI5 has been to be on the Council of Reference. And one of the very useful things that I believe the Institute does is these series of public lectures. And it's a witness to the value of them, that they are well attended and that there is such a wide interest in them from a wide variety of people. Our speaker this evening is the Canon Theologian at Westminster Abbey, also, and most importantly, of course, the chair of the Westminster Abbey Institute, as well as having a very distinguished career both in the academic world and in the church. Jamie will be speaking to us very shortly. All I wanted to add at this stage is that this is one of a series of lectures on trust in public life. Jamie is going to be talking about trust in people. There will be an opportunity at the end for question and answer and for discussion of what has been said, which I will be facilitating. And I think that's one of the very important parts of these events, to be able to hear not just from, as it were, the people at the front, but to hear from everybody else who has an interest in this subject. So without more ado, I will hand over, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan, very much indeed. I should, in the business and spirit of full disclosure, should say the last time I was in here was for my wedding reception, dancing a ceilidh. So I take no responsibility whatsoever for what is about to come. Is suspicion of others natural or not? To give anything like a complete answer to that extremely complex question, we would need to interrogate the grounds of our analysis. We would need to investigate themes including nature, sin, creation, community, intention. In what we call the Judeo-Christian tradition, mutual suspicion is certainly not what humans are called to, and certainly not what they're made for. The opposite of suspicion is trust. And yet, to trust is to risk, to make ourselves vulnerable, and to trust is to place the center of the universe somewhere other than myself. The word which the New Testament writers use for trust is the same as that used for faith. From pistis, pisteo, can come faithfulness, trust, reliability, that which can be believed. So trust in people needs to be seen alongside other forms of trust, faith, belief. Trust is certainly a sinew necessary for the functioning and flourishing of a healthy society, but trust is also a choice. Trust can't be injected into the social system like a vaccine or an antidote. Conditions have to be created to make trust realistic, even perhaps worthwhile. This is so from the most basic human social units. Cultures of trust in which people can be formed in the family, in school, in the local community. These networks by which people learn together what trust is provide formation in and through habit. Cynicism becomes all too easy when those conditions are frequently absent or routinely undermined. For religious people, hope becomes possible in that which is not seen, precisely because of what they believe or sense about the broader ambient truth. Similarly, trust in societal terms needs to be incubated by patterns of expectation and behavior. A creeping suspicion of one another has been eating away at our sociality in all sorts of subtle ways over the last few years. Brexiteer, Remainer, pro or anti-lockdown, vaccinated or anti-vax, woke or cancelled. As ideological divides widen, empathy becomes harder to sustain, and as inequalities deepen, binaries become more brittle. Even proper structural attempts to address inequality can result in other paralyses of trust on frontiers previously unrecognized. 20 years ago, Honora O'Neill's now famous Wreath Lectures addressed a previous crisis of trust from a philosophical perspective, not least as it related to the media. All her questions not only remain pertinent, but essential to consider if we're to take seriously the challenge of energizing a society where human flourishing and environmental sustainability become central priorities rather than niche interests or useful slogans. When this lecture series was first discussed, the title my colleagues suggested was Trust in the People. Now, this is an immensely important topic in a representative democracy, not least at a time when that democracy is perhaps not quite as healthy as it might be. But it's not an unproblematic title. And I suggest that the title Trust in the People, the problem there lies in the definite article. Seemingly innocuous refrains such as the will of the people, alongside deeply chilling phrases like the enemies of the people, at the very least set one group up against another and raise the question of who may not be included in the phrase, the people. The American philosopher Judith Butler prompted us to ask, who is missed out in the formula, we the people, which famously opens the preamble to the United States Constitution? Any sense that the people is ever principally a kind of amorphous mass risks undermining the very dynamics of trust which can enrich society. Now, Scripture offers some rather salutary lessons here. For centuries, the Church's relationship with the Jewish people, our elder brothers and sisters, was characterized by what became known as the teaching of contempt. This was rooted in the idea that Jews had been unfaithful to God's covenant and were Christ killers. The resulting social implications for Jews in St. John Chrysostom's 4th century Antioch, in much of medieval Europe, and in the pogroms of the 19th and 20th centuries were persecution, exclusion, and an earlier version of fake news, as myths were spread about the murder of children, hardwired avarice, and global plots. Now, some have argued that the root of this hatred can be found in two words, in the way that the words hoi Judaioi, the Jews, are used, particularly in Matthew's and John's Gospels. Usefully ignoring the fact that Jesus was executed by crucifixion, a Roman means of punishment, the cry of his blood be upon us and upon our children has echoed down the ages to our own time. Hoi Judaioi refers to the Jewish people, and it's frequently used as a pejorative term. Similarly, but with a generally less violent reception history, the phrase hoi ethnoi resounds around the New Testament and the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of much of the Hebrew Bible, with a particularly negative tone. Hoi ethnoi is frequently translated as the Gentiles, but essentially it really means the others, those who are outside the covenant, the unclean, the unfaithful. Again, frequently a pejorative term, which refers to an amorphous mass of people defined simply by what they are not. So establishing who the people are, how we describe them, relate to them, is a project which really demands care. In order to rethink what trust in the people might mean, in a world where cultural diversity within national boundaries is increasing, not decreasing, and where the building blocks of public trust are corroded, we may need to think again both about the dynamics of trust itself and how we approach the subject of groups which either ask for trust or seek to trust. Trust is primarily a relational and a moral reality rather than a legal one, even if elements of trust can be codified, systematized, mastered, even incentivized. If trust is really to be trust, it springs from an active decision rather than a passive or naive acceptance of a fait accompli. In his recent book, The Habit of Excellence, Why British Army Leadership Works, Langley Sharp reflects on the Archbishop of Canterbury's view that if you don't care for your people, you can't ask them to do hard things. It is, of course, possible for people and groups to be falsely allured into misplaced trust. My colleague Anthony Ball reported a fortnight ago that the current statistics portray that trust is greater in oppressive regimes than it is in secular democracies. But perhaps here we need to differentiate, as he did, between cognitive and affective trust. Affective trust, largely an emotional or heart-based thing, is too easily abused, whilst cognitive trust, worked out in the mind and intellect, can be too easily incentivized. So maybe what we're after in public life is a combination of the two, heart and head together, making a decision which recognizes the reality or quality of the subject which is to be trusted. Research published in the Journal of Business Ethics claims that ethical leadership leads to higher levels of both affective and cognitive trust. To be precise, in data harvested from 184 employees and their supervisors, this research claims that ethical leadership leads to the development of cognitive trust, which then influences the development of affective trust. In other words, in the professional environment, it seems that people first engage in professional trust before allowing that more personal element to enter the equation. But in this context, what might be the secret ingredients of the ethical leadership which leads to cognitive trust and which then opens the way to affective trust? Well, we could just simply stand here and list abstract virtues or other skills such as people management, body language, group dynamics, and doubtless someone somewhere has devised a very expensive course, probably an MBA, which will teach you all this. But I was very struck by another anecdote offered by Langley Sharp in his book, which perhaps offers the right kind of advice in distilled form. Patrick Marriott, the former Commandant of Sandhurst, recalls asking cadets shortlisted for the Sword of Honour accolade 4 questions, which included, "What have you learnt of leadership?" He recounts that the best answer he ever heard was, "To sacrifice control in order to command." To sacrifice control in order to command. Here's a profound example of a professional situation where the dynamics of trust really can thrive. Because trust is a bond which needs to be strengthened, ideally from both ends of the relationship. Showing oneself to be trustworthy is a good ingredient for becoming trusted, at least in the cognitive mode. But one notable thing about that Sandhurst answer is that there is a sense here of a leader giving something up, or releasing that which he or she may have held as an easier option. It may be more straightforward, more reliable, more reportable, less risky to control a situation, but to command, to oversee, that means responsibility, character, and fundamentally, a sense of the whole operation. As Sharp goes on to reflect, for this to work well, it relies on empowerment of others, trust in their initiative, and an openness when dealing with problems. In short, this is a mode of operation in which affective trust really can grow, because it is a response to character. But why should we trust at all? And in particular, why might the human person or human groups need to learn how to trust? The first president of the Czech Republic, Václav Havel, spoke of, and I quote him, "the tension between the living experience of meaning on the one hand and its unknowableness on the other. The tension between the living experience of meaning on the one hand and its unknowableness on the other." He was not the first philosophical thinker to articulate this dialectic. Although the question's an ancient one, it's fair to say that the challenge has become more intense given the sheer amount of knowledge we now have at our fingertips. The more we know about the world and our place within it, the more there is to know. And if we have any degree of humility or integrity, the more we realize that we do not understand. In Havel's terms, the unknowableness of meaning has become more complex. My own lived experience, with its accumulated narratives, opinions, and tentative working conclusions, that is only my lived experience. In order to have any broader sense of truth, or the diversity of complexity, I need to look beyond myself. Now, one theologian who's done very important work on personhood in the last century is the Greek Orthodox theologian John Zizoulas. I suggest that a short, and I promise short, study of some of his insights might help us develop a sense of why trust in people and trust in the people might be able to share similar dynamics. Personhood, the phrase he uses, personhood, indicates a degree of inherent dignity, a social identity, a network of relationships. Zizoulias's groundbreaking first study was a book called Being as Communion. In it, he explores the deepest meaning of personhood from the perspective of the Greek theological fathers. His own exploration of the concept of person leads into some profoundly perceptive insights into the nature of the church, but I suggest they can also help us tonight. He begins with a study of personhood from ancient Greco-Roman cultures. From a Platonic perspective, a person, in our sense of that word, was ontologically impossible because the soul was not permanently united with the body. The soul could, for example, constitute another individuality by reincarnation, for example. The term prosopon, person, is related to the concept of a mask in Greek theatre. It is, in this culture, from behind the mask that the character works out his or her freedom or rationality. This person is nothing but a mask, because, he writes, man exists for the sake of the world, not the other way around. Hence, the relationship of the actor with the mask is a tragic one, because it's only through the mask that the actor really becomes a person. Similarly, in Roman thought, one may have social or legal relationships, indeed identities, collectively and individually, but these are not linked with the ontology, the inner nature of the person. Roman thought, Zizoulias explains, is focused on human reality as essentially forming associations or contracts, collegia, organizing human life in a state. Therefore, one person could play very many different roles. The Roman concept of personhood simultaneously denies and affirms human freedom. As personae, humans subordinate their freedom to the organized whole, whilst at the same time tasting the tantalizing possibility of freedom as a result. One's relationship to the state constituted, conferred selfhood and identity. There is not any strong sense of personhood in these cultures being identified with the being or the inner reality or the dignity of the human. Zizoulias argues that it was the outlook of the Bible and the suppleness of the Greek fathers which united the person with his or her inner being, and which connected the person with the absolute self. Now, the American theologian David Bentley Hart is one contemporary thinker who has articulated something very similar. He claims that Christianity's teaching about God taking on a human face in Christ changed our perception of the person forever. I'm just going to quote from his very provocatively titled book, Atheist Delusions. I quote him, "In the light of Christianity's absolute law of charity, we came to see what formerly we could not. The autistic or Down syndrome or otherwise disabled child, for instance, for whom the world can remain a perpetual perplexity, which can too often cause pain, but perhaps only vaguely and fleetingly charm or delight. The derelict or wretched or broken man or woman who has wasted his life away. The homeless, the utterly impoverished, the diseased, the mentally ill, the physically disabled, exiles, refugees, even criminals and utter reprobates. To reject, turn away from, or kill any or all of them would be, in a very real sense, the most purely practical of impulses. To be able, however, to see in them not only something of worth, but indeed something potentially godlike, to be cherished and adored, is the rarest and most ennoblingly unrealistic capacity ever bred within human souls." So that's a perspective from what in theology we call Christology, from the person of Jesus. Zizoulias claims that these insights, though, are not just Christological, not just rooted in incarnation, but rather in the Christian faith, he says, as Trinity, where personhood is identified with relationship. There follows a very slightly complicated discourse, which I shan't bore you with, in which he articulates that humans find it impossible to exercise their ontological freedom absolutely because they're tied to their createdness. In other words, by the fact that they're not God. Humanity's inability to ensure its absolute own identity in the world, he argues, culminates in death. And yet, Zizioulas argues that the person does not want simply to be, but rather to exist as a concrete, unique, and unrepeatable entity. This cannot be assured by nature, but the life of God, he says, is realized as an expression of free communion, as love. He continues, life and love are identified in the person. The person does not die only because it is loved and loves. Outside the communion of love, the person loses its uniqueness and becomes a being like other beings, a thing without absolute identity and name, without a face. Life for the person means the survival of the uniqueness of its inner reality, which is affirmed and maintained by love. Congratulations if you're still with me. John Zizioulas is, of course, a theologian and a bishop, and writes about these topics from the perspective of one of the most distinguished Christian intellectuals of our age. After this section, he moves into biology, into ecclesiology, and there we do not need to go. Although I do note, in passing, very seriously, that it is very difficult to discuss these topics of personhood and identity without venturing into the realm of religious language. But for now, I just want to harvest some basic points. Number one, it is possible in the 21st century to live in a way which finds personhood only in the wearing of masks or in the projection of roles. Instrumentalization of the other and a focus on utility or usefulness at the expense of appreciating deeper questions of identity undermines the possibility of trust, person to person. End of story. Point two. Identity and personhood is still frequently subsumed into groupthink or the collegia system. We fail to take proper account of human dignity and fail to prioritize human flourishing when this happens. Point three, even the secular West struggles with the finitude of human existence and still has more than a hunch that love is key to some kind of survival or existence beyond the grave, even if only in memory. Point four, being, personhood, is found in relationship. That relationship is rooted in solidarity and accountability. This is so between individuals, and I suggest these principles are also important for establishing trust between groups, trust which is simultaneously cognitive and affective. My next subheading, probably for myself, is why bother? Well, I'll try and explain why bother. For John Zizioulas, the key theological word for discussing interpersonal relationships in what admittedly can seem a disarmingly complex theological scheme is quite straightforward. That key word is love. Reflecting on another great Eastern theologian, Maximus the Confessor, Rowan Williams explains that this is a kind of dispassionate love, which doesn't engage on the grounds of individual characteristics, nor as a reward, but simply as the recognition of what things are by their nature. This mutuality is, and here I quote Rowan, to seek and to know the object without self-referential desire, and to love the unknown future into which they are moving, or in other words, to love the excess of their being. Without relationship with others, humans are frequently collapsed in on themselves. In fact, the German reformer Martin Luther defined sin as a double turning in on oneself, incurvatus in se es. It's a magnificent construct, literally, so bent over that we can't see around ourselves, away from ourselves, or even ourselves. Establishing how we relate to one another as persons, rather than as means to ends, is right near the heart of this question of how we establish trust. It is not only our neighbour who gains when love is a social force. We gain too, because our neighbour reveals a truth to us which we otherwise would not know. That might sound like a rather romantic thing to say, but it's primarily a statement about the limits of our own individual knowledge and capacity, and our need for one another to know anything more than a very partial truth in any situation. In Langley Sharp's book on army leadership, he reflects on the need for collective command, in situations which are simply too complex and intricate, without the expertise and advice of a wide range of others. One general reflects that for this collective command to work, a high degree of trust needs to be grown between teams and ranks, underpinned by good standard operating procedures as a handrail to speed, not a brake on initiative. Good operating procedures as a handbrake to speed, not a brake on initiative. As long ago as the 1990s, the cultural commentator Harman Griswold said that analysing contemporary culture was like trying to examine snowflakes in a blizzard. In the disastrously polarised debates of the last half-decade, and in the hinterland of the culture wars which now threaten our common language and cultural grammar, we have begun to see, and I underline we have only just begun to see, how very dangerous it is when we fail to appreciate and celebrate shared basic assumptions. We cannot imagine that it will be possible to strengthen trust between people, institutions, groups, or governments without some commonly celebrated basic operating procedures. In discussing trust in institutions during an earlier lecture in this series, my colleague Canon Anthony Ball highlighted honesty, humility, compassion, and confidence as four essential characteristics to underpin an improvement in public trust. But in most of what remains of this lecture, I want to explore just one quality which brings much of this together, and through which we might be able to deploy some of what I have suggested is important about personhood more broadly when considering questions of trust. So, solidarity, a handbrake to speed. Solidarity has been a particularly important tenet of Christian reflection on public ethics for well over a century. It's one fundamental key to building trust between individuals and between groups. I want to root what I'm going to say in two principles. Firstly, the solidarity that operates within the market cannot always be described as genuine solidarity. If I'm expecting a cashed-out outcome from my solidarity with you, that is unlikely to be mature or rich enough to sustain trust in the midst of flux or disagreement. Gratuitous solidarity is one which recognizes the dignity of people or groups for their own sake and enabled by empathy. Principle number 2, we need to move away, consciously move away, from the sense that solidarity only comes about when there is a common enemy. Solidarity can be weaponized, it can be corrupted, but in those cases, it's unlikely to contribute either to the maintenance of genuine trust or be an adequate response to personhood. One might argue that those anti-Jewish movements inspired by the phrase hoi Judao had their own form of solidarity, one group bolstering itself up against the other. But that solidarity was corrupted and unable to participate in a vision of love as a social and organizational force within the polis. True solidarity contributes towards the thickening or enriching of relationships. In his encyclical Fratelli Tutti of 2020, Pope Francis offers the following observation. I quote him. The fragility of world systems in the face of the pandemic has demonstrated that not everything can be resolved by market freedom. It has also shown that in addition to recovering a sound political life that is not subject to the dictates of finance, we must put human dignity back at the centre, and on that pillar, build the alternative social structures we need." End quote. There's been a tendency amongst some theological and philosophical thinkers to dismiss the market wholesale, as if complete replacement of the system is currently possible, or indeed worth the assumption that the alternatives would necessarily be better. Instead, it is neoliberal tendencies which fail to place human dignity at the centre of the conversation, which mitigate against trust. Genuine solidarity is, of course, something needed and possible within the market. Pope Francis continues, "Without internal forms of solidarity and mutual trust, the market cannot completely fulfill its proper economic function. And today, this trust has ceased to exist. In some closed and monochrome economic approaches, for example, there seems to be no place for popular movements that unite the unemployed, temporary and informal workers, and many others who do not easily find a place in existing structures. Yet those movements manage various forms of popular economy and of community production. What is needed is a model of social, political, and economic participation that can include popular movements and invigorate local, national, and international governing structures with that torrent of moral energy that springs from including the excluded in the building of a common destiny, whilst also ensuring that these experiences of solidarity which grow up from below, from the subsoil of our planet, can come together, be more coordinated, and keep on meeting one another." End of that rather long quote. So Pope Francis is arguing for the development of structures of trust supported by the principles of solidarity and subsidiarity. But he also suggests that forms of social friendship are at the centre of this vision. These experiences of solidarity, in his words, need to keep meeting one another. In other words, it's not sufficient for forms of solidarity to grow in vacuums or to assume that such meeting one another will happen by accident or osmosis. Instead, the task is to develop a new culture which takes seriously the many challenges of our age and places human dignity and the dignity of the good earth at the centre of the conversation. Towards the end of that encyclical Fratelli Tutti, there is a quite remarkable section when the Pope argues that encounter needs to become culture. I quote him, "The word culture points to something deeply embedded within a people, its most cherished convictions and its way of life. A people's culture is more than an abstract idea. It has to do with their desires, their interests, and ultimately the way they live their lives. To speak of a culture of encounter means that we, as a people, should be passionate about meeting others, seeking points of contact, building bridges. This becomes an aspiration and a style of life. The subject of this culture is the people, not simply one part of society that would pacify the rest with the help of professional and media resources." I'm just going to repeat that last sentence. The subject of this culture is the people, not simply one part of society that would pacify the rest with the help of professional and media resources. Not a vision of utopia, but rather one which demands serious, hard work, strategic drive, and a willingness to face up to the reality of genuine disagreement and hard difference. Recognizing that we need to create a climate in which it just might be possible to trust those with whom we may disagree would signify a profoundly different and indeed deep change in culture. As Pope Francis points out, this is not to argue for a consensus on paper, or what he calls a transient peace for a contented minority. Trust across ideological divides or between people and groups which come to rather different conclusions is instead to risk a deep form of solidarity which undertunnels the noise of a zero-sum culture and enables trust to grow in ways which might not be immediately obvious or indeed immediately fruitful. It's an encouragement to keep at it. Rowan Williams calls this a contemplative practice of politics, which works towards the difficult common ground on which the majority and the minority can negotiate together. This kind of vision is liberated from the need to rely on a common enemy to shore up its cause. It's deeper than that. Open to risk, rejection, and reconciliation, it takes seriously the fact that no single person and no single group possesses the entire truth. As Rowan Williams puts it, I can only be where I truly am by recognizing that there is no fixed place where I am innocently and timelessly I, alone and incorrupt. We need to learn trust wisely, discerningly, and rooted in some fundamental virtues and values in order to learn more about the whole world. We will only be able to sense the transformative power of trust when the process is supported by a whole architecture of virtue, when we're publicly able to gather around commonly held first principles which embrace and include rather than binarize and exclude. If this is to have any traction, we will need to take responsibility for our decisions in the knowledge that people, including ourselves, frequently get things wrong. A culture of encounter is one where forgiveness, compromise, and reconciliation are not dirty words. What could be more generative of trust than a fulsome apology? What is more human, more embodied, more revealing of a mature character and personhood than a fulsome apology? So to conclude, I began by sharing my nervousness about that phrase, trust in the people, principally because it has the effect of encouraging us to consider groups as amorphous masses, flattening out diversity and leading to a binary, an unsustainable binary, where some are in and some are out. I suggest that a theological description of personhood opens up a more attractive and appropriate vision, one which takes dignity, diversity, and relationship as primary characteristics which will assist in building the trust we seek. Groups are groups of people, plural. We need a rehumanizing of our groupthink. So instead of discussing trust in the people, or indeed trust in people, maybe we need to think a little more about trust within the people. Solidarity, or in theological terms communion, depends on otherness. And it may be that the greatest crisis is trust amongst or within groups. That's why the sinews seem to be coming apart. At the moment, even the most obvious spaces for developing trust within the people are corrupted by less trusting logics. The church almost always falls into partisan lines. Local politics is too often taken over by ideology. Social media, which could be a place where diverse opinions can be shared, frequently just shores up the tribe. And the creeping practice of online anonymity is especially destructive of the kind of culture of encounter that Pope Francis speaks of. If we ever speak of trust in the people, or risk those phrases like the will of the people, we should take care to remember that the people are in fact groups of persons, which therefore have multiple personalities and multiple agendas, even when a single slogan obscures that reality. How they and we interact together, how we incubate trust, solidarity, and truthfulness as habits which don't need to be defended against another, are some of the greatest but maybe most fruitful challenges of our age. To see our society as rich with the possibility of encounter amongst groups of friends might yet be a bottom line worth fighting for. Thank you very much indeed.
I think it falls to me to sort of offer an initial response, which I have to say I think is challenging, and it's challenging for the very best of reasons, which is there is a huge amount of thought and learning and insight in what you've said, Jamie. And I had the slight advantage of having seen a prior draft, so I haven't entirely had to make this up on the spur of the moment. But if I can just say, I genuinely think that it is very, very illuminating to think about these trust issues in terms not just of institutions, but of people. And I thought your phrase of trust as being primarily a relational and moral reality was certainly struck a chord with me, and I think it's a very, very rich way of considering this. So thank you for that. I was going to make a couple of sort of questions really to start off the conversation. The first was you've obviously spent a lot of time reflecting and thinking about this. How bad do you think the problem is? There are various quotations in there which suggest that the model is very badly broken, but equally there is some evidence that in people's everyday lives and in their local environment, in their personal experience, actually trust continues to work quite well. Most people think that MPs are rogues, but their MP isn't too bad. Perhaps because they've met them, or they have some personal relationship with them. So, how bad is the illness which you are sort of diagnosing? And the other thing is, you painted, I thought, a very attractive picture of a culture of encounter. I guess the challenge is, what does one do to create the circumstances where that culture of encounter can become a reality?
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed. Well, just a few thoughts. Thank you for those extremely important questions. The diagnosis, I think, is really complex, and there's nothing worse than hearing an expert in one discipline pontificate on lots of disciplines. So I would want to say that for a full answer, we need anthropologists, sociologists, social scientists, political theorists, pollsters in the room. But I do wonder if the very feature of trust in the local but distrust of the broader is itself revealing of quite a deep crisis. I suspect it's not just a deep crisis of trust, though. I think it's a deep crisis of public consciousness. How do we assess the macro? How do we assess the broader, the international, the global, the national? How do we assess that? Do we have the kit available to us in public life to really have a full sense of that? Now, obviously, there are facets that in this country we are privileged to have: a free media, a free press, being one of them. But I wonder whether we have the moral, the philosophical, the intellectual apparatus as a society to diagnose the problem properly. That's my first thought on that question. The other thought is really related to this sense of what sociality is. How do we describe groups that are bigger than us? How do we describe groups that we're part of even? How do we account for human diversity? If our default is to think in a sort of them-us way, that's a real problem. And I think that is so deeply solidified into human culture. Now, I believe that in part, I have to say, fess up here, because I'm very strongly influenced by the work of St. Augustine. Who, I just believe humans are sort of hardwired into that sort of binary stuff. We find it very hard to wriggle out of it. But when we do wriggle out of it for a minute, as we do, we genuinely do, we see the possibilities of transformation. And I think that, by the way, that's not a particularly Christian insight. I think that's an insight that can be applied across the board. When we sense the possibilities of a different way of operating, when we sense the possibilities of a culture of encounter, we sense what might be possible. Run with that. Your second question about how does all this cash out? I think the role of what we think of as intermediate institutions really matters here. What would it be for our public institutions, our intermediate institutions of education, of formation, of humanism in the broadest sense? What would it be for them to actually consciously teach on trust? To dig in, to take Langley Sharp's book and examples, to dig into the examples. Why does this matter? How does it work? And of course, I was thinking when you were asking your first question, the most basic expression of human trust in some ways is crossing the road or getting up in the morning. We trust, don't we, when we cross the road? We trust when we get out of bed. There is an instinct there. But how might that very basic fundamental instinct be harvested by our intermediate institutions, by our educational system, to form people just to ask those questions?
Thank you. We have the opportunity to ask questions or any comments, so please, gentleman on the left there, please.
Thank you so much for that, Father. That was really insightful. I'm not sure where to start. I'm going to have to reflect on your transcript to be able to really take in a fraction of what you've said. But it's probably appropriate as we're in a school. Is there a way of creating some form of kit, even if not perfect, to help future generations to think in a different lateral way towards how we might build a much more confident and reassuring and trusting society at all levels, be it individual, corporate, public?
Well, I think there is. The sort of PHSE programs that are available in schools, in part, I think, try to do that. Pastoral care networks in school trying to do that. But more broadly, I think of a phrase that Peter Hennessy, who's a friend to so many of us at the Abbey, uses, the better angels of our nature. How do we prioritize the better angels of our nature in intellectual formation, in human formation? How do we allow people to work from the basis of seeing another not as a threat but as a promise? And again, as a Christian theologian, I think we have some really, 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 really hard work to do here, because I think humans are quite often geared the other way. But I think the only other thing I would want to say is that it needs to be conscious. We can't just trust that this work will happen by accident. We need someone to sit down and work out what would it look like for a program of work on trust to take place within schools. What would it look like for a program of work on trust to take place within business schools? Yeah? It's got to be conscious, and we've got to know why it matters. Sense the better angels, work out why it matters, I think. Just a few thoughts. I'm sorry that's not very coherent.
Please.
David, thank you so much for your thoughts. Apologies for a slightly practical application of your intelligence, but for me, trust is a little bit like morale. Sometimes the more you talk about it, the more it plummets. But we often look at trust through the lens of the lost trust, looking down the bearing of institutions or groups that have, in their perception, failed them. But I wonder, looking down the other end of the telescope, have we as a society grown accustomed to a little bit of over-expectation in others? And I just wonder what your thoughts are in terms of expectations we should or do have as a society.
Thank you, Andrew, very much indeed. I mean, yes, the managing of public expectation, I think, is really important. Now, to get into this deeply, one would want to ask questions, what belongs to the state, what belongs to the family, what belongs to the individual. But I do think, one example of this is just how quickly public opinion can change. One of the best examples, I think, of public trust has been the vaccine program. One of the best examples of public trust was the way in which people just rejoiced in the NHS at the beginning of this pandemic. But of course, we know that public trust can become very capricious. It can change in the wind. So I do think that a sort of monitoring of expectations is really important. And I'm not for a second suggesting that there is a crisis of trust at every single level, because I don't think there is. There are great examples of public trust. The fact that we have such a thing as a general election is an example on one level of public trust. The fact that we allow ministers of the Crown to go and make decisions that's on one level public trust. But I think the granularity of what we think we're doing when we trust is something which is confused at the moment.
Thank you. Lady at the back, and then we'll come to Francis D'Souza.
Thank you very much for your insights. I think the lecture was quite compelling. So my question is, to what extent does having more data or more, with all the technological advancements, social media, we have more opinions on everything at any one moment in time. To what extent does having all of that information and echo chambers, as it were, influence this? Because, for example, you hear in trust in the public sector, trust in government, trust in politicians. That seems to have won. But if you look more broadly, people seem to be okay. People not protesting massively on the streets. So to what extent does having more access to all this information influence this? Thank you.
Thank you very, very, very much indeed. Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? We are drowning in information. We're drowning in data. I remember a conversation with a foreign intelligence officer, and I asked him what he felt the biggest threat to the world was at the moment. I'd be interested, Jonathan, to hear your thoughts on this. He said the biggest challenge, not threat, the biggest challenge was the regulation of the internet. How you do it, how you do it globally, how you do it in a way which protects freedom of speech, truth, blah, blah, blah. This sense that we are drowning in information, I think you're right, is a real problem. But the echo chamber is equally problematic. It's one reason why broadcasters like the BBC are so important for public trust. How do we ensure that there are trustworthy public institutions which are not going to be bought off or bought up, but are actually going to be able to simply want to pursue as objective a truth as possible? We need to be absolutely upfront about this. Truly, utterly, straightforwardly objective reporting and truth is extremely difficult. There is no view from nowhere. But I think you're right. The drowning in information is a real issue. So, but let's be conscious right across public life that the drowning is a problem. Let's not just, there's far too much sort of business as usual on this front. These problems are massive. Thank you very much for identifying it.
Thank you. So Francis.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I have some confused thoughts, which I think may come out as a devil's advocate question more than anything. Very many years ago, I was an anthropologist, and I remain interested in human evolution. And the material evidence suggests that our earlier ancestors defined themselves in terms of their opposition to other groups, and that the idea of an encounter becoming a widespread culture across groups is not that to the fore. And of course, one of the reasons for this is because there's always a competition for resources. And I wonder whether you are not being a little bit, it's too big an ask in this day and age to expect or hope that people will become superhuman when in fact the competition for resources is ever greater, and the need to define a group in order to maintain harmony within the group is actually because of opposition.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. And I think it's very, very interesting, the evolutionary pattern and structure of this, I think. It's yet another piece of evidence, in my view, as to why science and religion are not opposites, but actually need to work together in this stuff. Is it too big an ask? It depends how brave we are. It depends on how much it matters. I mean, I think the current war in Ukraine is a kind of case in point. You know, we can either pursue this the old way, and there are going to be winners and there are going to be losers, or we can say, there is justice that needs to be done here. Point one, there is liberation and reconciliation which needs to happen, and then we need to get down to the very, very, very serious business of working out what reconciliation on a broader level looks like. Are we really going to just win this conflict by one side pummeling the other into the ground? Is that? So I think it depends on how brave we are. It depends on the kind of choices publicly we're willing to make. Given that humans are inexorably rooted in the business of making choices, I suspect this will depend on quality of leadership, on convening public will. But Francis, I do absolutely agree with you. At times it seems an impossible ask. But I don't think that we should necessarily believe that the status quo is something which has to simply keep on churning on. And actually, incidentally, I think that groups can be helpful in this, not there's a kind of healthy tension, isn't there, between disagreement. I'm not trying to flatten out disagreement at all. I'm talking about how people who disagree with one another can learn to trust each other because they can find some degree of negotiated common ground, I think. Yeah.
We're running out of time. There are a number of people who want to ask. What I'm going to do is take two questions, as it were, at the same time, and make it more difficult for Jamie. So the gentleman here.
We like a challenge.
Well, first of all, thank you both very much indeed. For many years, I was one of the people who contributed to our drowning in information and data because I was a journalist at the BBC for 30 years. And as you say, there is no reporting from nowhere. But the BBC, a curious institution because its purpose was not to sell things and make money, but to be trusted. Coming into work every morning meant earning afresh the trust of millions of people we would never meet, which was a daunting but at the same time inspiring task. The reaction we get is curious because you find that the BBC is trusted on some things and not on others, perhaps not trusted by a lot of people on domestic politics where it might be on Ukraine, and yet it's the same people doing the same job, they hope to the same standard, though acknowledging in all instances that they don't always do that job perfectly or even adequately, but they try as best they can. But it was a curious place to work where trust was, and for my colleagues are still there, still is, central to the whole purpose of being.
Thank you very much.
And I think there's a gentleman at the back who's been very patient.
Can individualism be reconciled with public trust, or is there inherent contradiction?
Thank you very much indeed. The first point, I think purpose is really important. Purpose is linked, what I've said before in this conversation, to becoming conscious of what you're doing. And I think the purpose of the BBC is being known to be trustworthy. That's great. Because purpose is related to identity, purpose is related to character, I think. So thank you for that. That's really important. This business is about individualism. The problem is the ism, because in a sense, individuals, we all have to make individual decisions. So on one level, individualism can help as a great energizer of public trust, or being an individual can energize public trust. If individuals realize that they have the agency, the power to decide, I'm not going to do this like that, I'm going to do it like this. That's a great thing. The problem is the ism. Individualism, establishment, whenever you see an ism at the end of a word, raise an eyebrow, I think. Because it's sort of saying, hand up here, a bit big for your boots. Perhaps. That was unscripted and almost certainly recorded. There we are.
Thank you very much indeed for the many questions. I think it demonstrates the chord that you have struck, that so many people wanted to contribute, and I apologise that we weren't able to take all the questions that were clearly there, including a few from the home team, so I'll probably be in trouble later. I think my last and very pleasant responsibility is to thank Jamie on our behalf for the really stimulating talk, your frank and helpful responses, and for all the enormous amount of work that must have gone into it. Jamie Hawkey, thank you very much indeed.